Welcome, everyone, to today's discussion about changing the conversation around CEO leadership. I'm Margot McShane, and I co-lead Russell Reynolds Associates Global Board and CEO practice. I'm also the co-founder of RA Artemis. Thank you for joining us. We know how busy all of you are, and we're excited to welcome clients and candidates and colleagues from all around the world. Today, we'll be exploring the groundbreaking research that opens a window into the societal perceptions of CEOs. And before I introduce our esteemed panel, note that if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A box. We hope to spend a few minutes at the end and possibly throughout this session answering them. So now let me introduce our distinguished panel. First, Lisa Wardell. She is the former CEO of Adtalem Global Education. She serves on several boards, including American Express, and is on the executive committee of the Business Council. She's a fierce advocate of education and inclusive leadership teams that drive value for organizations. Jorgen Knudstorp is the former CEO of Lego Group. Jorgen serves on several boards, including Starbucks Coffee and IMD, the Swiss Business School. He has been involved in a number of CEO succession processes and has an enormous amount of insight into how to build robust pipelines of viable CEO succession candidates. Marianne Sieghart, she's the author of The Authority Gap, Why Women Are Still Taken Less Seriously Than Men and What We Can Do About It. She is founding partner of the Authority Gap Consultancy, a BBC4 presenter, and both a for-profit and nonprofit board director. And Hetty, she is a CEO and board leadership advisor at Russell Reynolds and a trusted advisor to countless chairs and CEOs. She's been with the firm for 20 years, and she's also my co-founder of RA Artemis. So welcome and thank you for being with us today. We're very excited to have you all. So first, we want to talk about the research context. Before we dive into our findings, time to tell a different story, analyzing societal and media representations of CEOs, want to explain the context, which is that one of our most important jobs at Russell Reynolds is to help our clients identify and develop great CEOs. That's why I and we found this research so fascinating. Given that women lead only approximately 10% of publicly listed companies globally, and frankly, this number has really flatlined over a long period of time. This is a key opportunity for our clients to sort of raise awareness of why this is and understand how bias and misperceptions play into this. Moreover, the world has seldom been more complicated to lead. In other words, the CEO role is only getting harder, not easier, and also, frankly, less attractive to some viable candidates. So with all of this, our goal is to use this research, share it, enlighten, to build awareness, but also change the conversation a little bit. So how do we go about this research? First, we analyzed over 20,000 news articles covering about 750 CEOs from FTSE 100 to S&P 500 to Euronext 100 companies. We used machine learning to examine how CEOs were portrayed across 6 key attributes commonly associated with CEO leadership, including ambition, confidence, knowledge, decision-making, and intelligence. We also analyzed task-oriented traits like innovation, risk-taking, alongside people-oriented traits such as emotional intelligence and empathy. So it's important to note that we use this media not to blame the media, but have it as being a reflection of broader societal perceptions and unconscious bias. In other words, it's really about all of us, and this is enlightening all of us. The results were clear as well. Women CEOs face much higher levels of scrutiny and unconscious bias in the global media. Taken together, there's a risk that this has and will continue to hold back viable talent who could and should be considered for CEO. The data from these findings also allow us to understand the story that is being perpetuated and gives us an opportunity to tell a different story and ultimately change this conversation from one that's around unconscious biases related to how women are perceived and possibly perceive themselves as potentially suitable candidates for CEO roles. So with that, let's go into the actual findings. And to start, I'd like to ask my colleague Hetty to share the first one. Hetty?
Margot, thank you. So let's start with our finding 1, which is what we are calling the positivity gap. When we reviewed the media coverage, we found there was a significant disparity between how CEO departures are reported on, with women CEOs commented on 2 times more likely in their departure versus their male counterparts. And then in addition, the negative sentiment surrounding those departures was much higher, so 28 versus 18%. And then if you step back beyond that, from a CEO perspective, when referred to in the media, women CEOs were referred to by gender 17 times more commonly than their male counterparts. So you put that all together, you're finding necessarily we can see there is an overtly amplified gender focus when covering women CEOs in the media. If you take it back to what you were referring to a minute ago, Margot, around how we find ourselves at this sort of 10% or so range of CEOs being women of the largest companies in the world, you can see how you could start to perpetuate that narrative, because you'll find that the media is really skewed in the context of its negative review of doing the job itself as a woman.
You're on mute.
Thank you for that. That was coughing. Lisa, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about what in particular about what Hetty has shared and what I've shared resonates with you?
Yeah, so I was in the CEO role for about 5 years, excuse me, and then executive chairman for a year after that. So a pretty good range of time for that. And first of all, let me say I'm so excited to be a part of this, because it's all about coming to understanding this data so we can get to solutions. So really thrilled to be here. For me, I would give a couple of observations. For my departure, I actually had an internal successor and managed that with my board, which was a great outcome for me. So not so much in the media in terms of negative. But what I would say is the way that where I saw the positivity gap, so to speak, is really around how media covered me as a CEO. It was always woman first or female first versus performance. And I had an excellent track record at the company and had to continue to push having the media cover me in a way that talked about the actual results of the portfolio and of Adtalem. So I certainly see that. The other thing that I would just point out is that we did have an activist, as many companies do. And in fact, activists target women CEOs almost 30% more than men. But we did have an activist who we successfully challenged and beat. But that activist was very personal in the media and public in the media around me as a CEO, with personal attacks versus just an investment thesis, if you will. So I certainly saw that live and in action when I was in the role.
So how did this impact how you navigated the media and sort of all your stakeholders given those headwinds?
Yeah, so look, I think all CEOs, male and female, understand that there's such a broad range of stakeholders, and that you really do have to, you can't please everybody all the time. But one of the solutions that I worked with my board and with my, communications and public affairs teams, et cetera, was really to come up with and focus on the narrative for what we were doing. So for example, at Adtalem, we care about all education, but we really, really wanted to drive healthcare and medical education and address the shortages. And this was pre-COVID for physicians and nurses. And so we found opportunities for me as the CEO and also others on my executive team to speak on the nursing shortage, speak on how we're solving physician and residency slots and participation in the US and in fact globally, and really help drive the narrative so that when that's for positive media, so that when there were other things occurring that the media in general wanted to report on, there's that bank of positive reinforcement through actual performance of the company and of the executive team.
Understood. Thanks so much, Lisa. Now, Marianne, your book explores how women are taken less seriously than men. What findings resonate with you the most on this and align with your research on authority gaps?
Yeah, so women are expected to be less competent than men and therefore have to prove that they're competent before people accept their competence. And so women are twice as likely to say that they have to provide evidence of their competence, nearly twice as likely to say that people are often surprised at their abilities. So we start with a default assumption of a woman that she's not going to be as good as a man. And women of color are twice as likely as white people to say these things. So the further you are from the white male middle class default, the wider the authority gap becomes. And I use authority both in terms of expertise. So, you know, does she know what she's talking about? And also in terms of power. People are much more likely to resist women in authority in a position of power. So when you get a female CEO, people are going to be questioning, is she any good? Can she prove she's any good? Quite often when a woman is appointed as a CEO, the share price tanks on the day, and then she has to drag it back up again. And that is, you know, literal financial proof of the existence of the authority gap. And another thing that we find a lot, this certainly happens in performance appraisals, and I think it works its way all the way up to CEO, is that for women, people talk much more about their personality and much less about their achievements. And a woman with the same personality or the same character traits as a man will be judged very, very differently. So, for instance, women are 10 times more likely to be described as abrasive than men, but men are 3 to 4 times more likely to be described as confident. Now, what actually happens is quite often they're showing the same character trait, which is being confident, being assertive, showing leadership. When a man does that, it makes us feel comfortable. When a woman does that, it quite often makes us feel uncomfortable because she's going against stereotype. And so we therefore describe it not as being confident or assertive, but as being abrasive or strident or aggressive. And that makes it much harder for a woman to lead and for people to feel comfortable with her leading and not to dislike her.
So Mary, what advice would you give incoming women CEOs about managing media relationships?
Well, what all the research suggests, and indeed a lot of the very powerful women I interviewed for the book discovered, is that what you have to do as a woman, which you don't have to do as a man, is to overlay an enormous amount of warmth onto your personality in order to mitigate any hostility you're otherwise going to attract for being competent, confident, assertive, dominant, showing leadership. And so warm authority is really the only way through. And it means you have to be much more emotionally intelligent. You have to use humor. You have to smile a lot. I've really noticed in the era of Zoom how much I smile when I talk, which I hadn't realized before. And I think this is an unconscious reaction to, you know, thinking, oh, I don't want to seem threatening. I don't want to seem intimidating. And that's what female CEOs have to do in order to be effective.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, my very first boss told me women, when they're asserting themselves, are often they laugh or they get angry, you're sort of threading that needle. We'll come back to that finding, but I just want to go to Jorgen. Jorgen, you've been a CEO, you've worked on a lot of CEO succession projects. Did any of these findings surprise you?
They did not surprise me. I have so much evidence of this. I've not studied media so much, but when I relate to my experience in boardrooms, which is significant, and in management teams, it's exactly the case. And how do I know? Because I, for one, was one of those people who said, oh, I'm not like that. And I can explain a bit more about that. But then I remember, for instance, being very central in the selection process of a very senior female leader for a very senior job. And we were interviewing a bunch of people whether we should select this particular person. We then interviewed her and she said, oh, I think it's very obvious that it should be me. And the conversation afterwards amongst the male colleagues was like, oh, that's just too much. I mean, I'm wondering if she's too confident. So when I was reading this, it's like, oh my God, like this is a rerun of my whole experience. Why did I get it wrong in the first place? We all have our own stories. Maybe this is said a bit with a smile, but I was a kindergarten teacher for 2 years in a group of 10 women as the only male. I grew up with a mother who was a very red feminist. So I always thought like, oh, I'm this like super accepting person. I respect women so much. But it's a bit like when people say, oh, I don't see people's color. Well, that's not how you go about it. And so you think you're on the right side, but in fact, you're not, because you're not going deep into confronting your unconscious biases. And that unconscious bias is when you meet somebody who's not looking like the typical candidate, as pointed out both by Lisa and Marianne. And so the way you solve for that is you say to yourself, well, now we're seeing a less typical candidate. I'm really going to raise all my defenses now that bias doesn't overwhelm me. And if you are a very good board leader, lead independent director, chair, or just a good colleague in a board or CEO, you will actually not only say it for yourself, you will say, hey, guys, team, we should all be aware that it's super likely we will now have biases. So let's all make them explicit instead of implicit and go out of our way to not be overly influenced by that.
Interesting.
And
So,
if I could just, sorry, if I could just add to that, I so agree. Women do it too. This isn't just something that men do. We all do it. I do it, and I've written a book about it because this bias is called unconscious for a reason. We don't do it on purpose. It's inadvertent, and we can't put a lid on it or make it go away. But what we can do, as Jorgen just so brilliantly said, is notice when it manifests itself and just be much more aware and then try to correct for it.
Yeah, and I would just say, in terms of what Jorgen just said, too, men can be really helpful in helping you in that room and in those scenarios. So for me, my successor was my COO prior, and I was the 5th CEO that he had worked for and with, and the first 4 were white men. And he would tell me just how different a room was when the 2 of us would come in. First of all, everyone thought that he was the CEO, even though they had my name, prior in many, many cases. And he was able to really point out to me how behavior, again, unconsciously was happening in that room, which he had not seen for 4 CEOs before, meaning that it was most likely gender. So I think it's really important to address this with both male and female colleagues in the sort of how do we come to solutions here.
interesting. So on that point, and Hetty, you're going to be up next, but one of the attendees right now asked that she said that she was aware of this going through the CEO recruitment process as a female. And she's asked, what can we do to ensure these biases are addressed and don't continue to undermine female candidates in CEO succession processes? So in other words, what can directors do? What can sitting CEOs, what can CHROs do? And maybe we'll start with Jorgen on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on what I think you can do. I mean, I think it's actually recognizing what you're dealing with, and then when you start the process of selection, that you just say, we want a female candidate, if that's what the diversity we're talking about here. And it's just a must. You have to be on the list. And we want a really strong candidate, and we're not done until we can do that. So I think that becomes then a search criteria. And I know that it sort of gets into this discussion about quotas and so on. And I'm not necessarily arguing for quota, but I'm arguing for that it is an explicit search criteria. Because again, and this has been a terrible tragedy for most of my career in not performing up to this, I've learned it, in the last 10 years. If it's not a criteria in the moment of selection, it's not going to happen. It's just not moving the needle. So it has to be real and it has to be insisted on. Otherwise, there's just no difference being made.
Interesting. Hetty, as someone who's been extensively involved in long-term CEO succession planning with a bunch of clients, what stands out to you about the findings and what you're seeing in the market and what clients can do about it?
Well, I'm struck by also this conversation, thinking about, Lisa, when you talked about how you were evaluated perhaps more on yourself as a person, as a woman, than on your performance. And also, Marianne, you're talking about some of those adjectives, which we'll get more onto a bit later. But I suppose before we get into the specifics, at least we have made some progress, right? So certainly from a boardroom constitution point of view, life is looking a lot more interesting and choiceful and rich in that context. But when we go back to our 10% or so stuck statistic around CEOs. I think what I'm hearing from this is actually thinking about, and for those that might be aspiring CEOs listening to this, and those that you and I, Margot, are working with, is around this level of scrutiny, which I think we can't deny is harsher if you're sitting there as a woman CEO. I mean, I think within my market, in the FTSE in the UK, for example, a very well-known CEO, when she had her first AGM, she was critiqued personally on the basis of her gender. I'm very happy to say that she's taken that company from laggard to leader in its sector, but undeniably there. And I think something to pause on before we get into, and certainly rightly more of the solution orientation of this, is then thinking about the unintended consequences of this scrutiny. And I'm working with 2 women at the moment, both of whom would qualify very well on what we would consider the hard criteria to make you an ex-CEO, as in they're both running big P&Ls. They've both got multi-regional experience. They're both very well known for their people leadership. They've delivered significant shareholder value in their roles. But both of them are spending time with me at the moment, really questioning, but do I want to go for it? Do I want this role? Because specifically the reason they're citing is what's being talked about here, which is the media scrutiny, specifically because they are a woman CEO. And is it worth it? Now, if we think about that, it's shrinking the pool, right? You can see how we're getting stuck at this sort of 10% because it's, I think there are less people women specifically wanting to put themselves forward. Sorry, Margot, back to you.
No. Have you seen progress in terms of dynamics around how women CEO succession candidates are sort of making their way, or has it pretty much been the same throughout your career?
Yes, kind of yes and no, I suppose. I mean, I can give you an example of where I was not attached to these processes, but two very live or very recent examples where I don't think that is the case, where two major European businesses very recently just gone through their CEO succession. In both cases, they promoted an internal candidate. As far as I'm aware, and I think I understand, there was limited, if no process run in both of those decision-making processes. In both cases, there was an outstanding female executive sitting there who could have been under serious contention, not necessarily selected, but a serious contender. In neither case, one was the CFO, one was a P&L leader, were these women asked if they wanted to be considered. And one can only deduce from that either the board that was looking at them assumed they were not up for it, or they didn't see them and value them as potential candidates for the role. But before we kind of layer on too much gloom and doom on that, to your point, yes, we are starting to see, certainly working with certain clients, are finding things starting to shift. And our advice to clients is certainly around that, under what you mentioned before, Margot, around changing the conversation. So trying to change this echo chamber, which is repeating, to Marianne's point, not in any intentional way, but meaning that history has been repeating itself. And we're trying to help organizations think about really intentional actions, as you said earlier, around how we can change that conversation. And I'll just share just one as an example, which is when you think about your succession planning process over time, operating an opt-in versus an opt-out methodology has a dramatic impact on the final choice and outcome. If you have an opt-out strategy, you are going to allow for necessarily greater choice of leaders, of potential leaders to be evaluated, and getting to the final consideration, therefore a better choice around who you're selecting on. And it's not a semantics game. It may sound like I've just changed one word, but actually as a philosophy can make a really fundamental difference. And why wouldn't you, as a business, want to have greater choice? And at the same time, you've supported even better governance for your company.
Margot, you asked, I just wanted to add one quick thing to
Yeah.
what you and Hetty are saying, because you asked about solutions and what we can do. And I think one really critical thing is making sure throughout these processes, but also after these processes, that feedback is provided, and robust feedback, both for the board, for the search for maybe for the former CEO, et cetera, because that's how you sort of get to some unintended things. I'll give you one example. So I have interviewed for a couple of operating roles over the last 12 months or so. And in at least one case, another candidate was selected, which is fine. But then I was asked, actually two cases, I was asked if I would consider joining the board so that I could help the person who had not been a CEO before learn to be a CEO, which could be general practice, but I would think is probably more asked of a woman who has been a public company, U.S. public company CEO before, than it would if it were a man. So I think, and I think having the courage to give that feedback to the people who are running those processes is helpful in this situation, particularly in you all's roles.
That is such a great point, because this is part of why we want to change the conversation. And it doesn't have to be a male-female thing. It's more about really taking these hidden perceptions on male and female candidates, bringing them to the surface and allowing people to work with it, because ultimately as a CEO, you have to deal with all your stakeholders. Marianne, I'd love some quick advice for you in terms of if you had to pick one thing organizations can do to really kind of move the needle in perception, and as Lisa was saying, getting feedback so women can actually be perceived as viable candidates. What would you give?
Okay, so I think what most organizations do is they lament the fact that women are not progressing as fast up the career ladder as men. And in order to try to solve this problem, they throw all their money and all their energy and all their resources in trying to fix the women, as if the women are somehow deficient. And so they send the women on these confidence building courses and these empowerment courses and these leadership courses. And then the women come back all confident and empowered and full of leadership to exactly the same culture that was holding them back in the first place. And they're even more annoyed by it. And so what I always say is stop trying to fix the women and start trying to fix the culture. And crucially, that means involving men in this conversation, because men on the whole are not involved in it very much. They think, oh, I'm just going to get on and try and improve the P&L and improve the performance and let the women have their women's networks and go on their confidence building courses. But it's the workplace culture that is holding women back, and that is men as well as women. So I would say that's the most important thing. And can I add one small thing about media representation of CEOs? Having spent most of my life as a journalist, I'm now a recovering journalist. It is a really easy problem to solve. If every journalist writing about a female CEO simply asked before filing their copy, would I have said this about a man? And if the answer is no, delete. That's all you have to do. I'm not going to talk about this woman's appearance. I'm not going to talk about her personality. I'm going to talk about her achievements or lack of achievements. But I'm going to judge her on how good she is as a CEO and no more than that. It's a really easy problem to solve, but you need the awareness, don't you?
You do. That is great counsel. We would also just add to that celebrating what women do effortlessly in an easy way that is correlated with great CEOs. We have data on some of those things. So not just talking about fixing her, but celebrating and amplifying what she is doing well. So we need to thank you for this. Let's move on to key finding 2, which is the innovation and inspiration dichotomy. So our second finding reveals striking differences in how leadership qualities are perceived and described. So whereas men were twice as likely to be described as innovators, women were 72% more likely to be described as inspirational. And sitting in my chair, neither set of competencies are negative. In fact, they're positive, but the associations are interesting and the insight is telling. So this pattern extends across various attributes, with men more frequently described in terms of task-oriented skills like strategic thinking, risk-taking, while women are more often characterized by people-oriented skills like empathy and emotional intelligence. Again, not bad or good, but Jorgen, you've helped a lot of iconic brands navigate disruption, transformation, and innovate for the future, which is not easy. How can organizations ensure they recognize and support CEO leadership, which includes all of these traits, just not one or the other, but all of them?
Yeah. First of all, I smiled when I read this, because through my career, I've always been called, first and foremost, an inspirational leader. So I could strongly align and identify with it. And I can say from personal experience that is probably most valuable. I was lucky for many years as a very young, naive, inexperienced CEO to have a chair who said to me, there are just different ways to do this. I would do it in a completely different way than you, but the way you seems to be your way, and you do it with success. So that, I think, illustrates what we need. That and I think it's probably true in many companies, but it's certainly true in these, the example you described here, sort of iconic brands where the authenticity of the leader is crucial. But let's just say, I think the job of a CEO is to be the chief secretary of culture. People don't do what's on the official values or mission statement. People don't do what they read in the company presentation. They do what they observe. I think the Chinese have a word for it. They call it boss watching. And so the boss is describing the culture, and it's doing so through the behavior. And so you want that with authenticity, and that means you have to be yourself. And so the board needs to spend some time on this. And I was in one situation with a CEO who I was on the board, and I was there with another key shareholder, and we had selected the CEO. We were a little frustrated by how the CEO behaved. And then my partner on the board came back to me and said, we can't really complain, because we got exactly what we were told we were getting from the assessment of the CEO. It was exactly that we saw playing out. And that shifted our focus to, how do we make this person successful given this person is playing to the strengths that are in the inherent profile, instead of how come you're not more like me or like what we think it should be. And then, of course, as a board, ultimately, you have to make the choice and say, maybe we don't have the right profile, but that's your responsibility. That's actually what you're accountable for. So I think it's about allowing people to be who they are, and it's about allowing that there are different ways to solve the same problem. There's not one way to solve a problem. That's what is the basis of creativity, is there are many answers to every question, especially in management. And then that the boardroom and the management team allow for the diversity. And again, it takes often the leadership of the board or the management team to be willing to say, actually, we're getting better when we have dissent, when we have diversity of opinions. I think we will be better from that. And then it takes a very mature, constructive conflict resolving skill, which is, hey, I know we don't agree on this. I've heard you all. I've really worked very hard to integrate your perspective, but now we're making a decision. And even though we don't agree, I expect we will be working together on this afterwards. These are all, at least for me, it took almost a lifelong to learn to do such things. And I know what my mischievous behavior was before then. It was like working behind people's backs and not really taking the conflict out in the open and trying to ignore the diversity of opinions. So there's all of these really bad behaviors, because the bottom line is it takes an enormous maturity to navigate these situations. And that's why people, I guess, end up in teams that are incredibly uniform. Same gender, same ethnicity, same educational background, etc. Because then it just feels, quote unquote, so easy. But it's really not the mature outcome, and it's certainly not the right outcome for most businesses.
Huh. Interesting. And then Lisa, knowing the CEO job so well, where did you feel like you were underestimated and perhaps assumed to have requisite competency or not?
Yeah, so I did experience the stock drop when I took over as CEO, but you know, the company was also in turnaround mode, and I think that or in need of a turnaround, and I think that I was certainly underestimated in terms of whether I could do that and how long it would take. I'm pleased to say we got it done, and the stock quadrupled during that time and has done so again since my successor took over. So I'll take a little bit of credit for that part too. But I think that the issue around innovation and inspiration, obviously you want both. I think I was certainly underestimated on just performance and actual sort of strategic execution, because both of those things had to happen. But I also really did need to be an inspirational leader, because when you are coming into those situations, and I mean, many CEOs find them there, but I think a higher percentage of women CEOs and certainly new CEOs find themselves there. You have bad morale. You have a culture that needs to be fixed. You have a culture that's not focused on performance. It's focused on sort of status quo, and you know, don't break anything, and you'll get sort of 10% more than what you got the year before, and that's not good for a business, and it's not good for real long-term growth. So I would say that I agree with everything that's been said up to now about you need both of those things. But really, when you think about transformational leadership, and I consider myself sort of a cross between servant leadership and transformational leadership, it really is how you lead as a boss and how you lead the culture. And I think that is the piece where certainly my board was always supportive, but I think from an outside investor perspective, there were just a lot of questions about whether that could be done and whether the actual hardcore performance could be done while still having the empathy and the cultural shift to be more of a people inclusive culture.
Interesting. And then Marianne, what insights and solution does your work offer in terms of breaking down some of these stereotypes that we're talking about?
I just think the most important thing is to open people's eyes to the incredibly outdated and archaic stereotypes that are lurking in the deepest recesses of their brains. And that includes me. It's all of us, right? It's not just men. But I think that men probably think about it less because it doesn't affect them so badly. And so I think it's really important for us to increase awareness, all of us, of how our stereotypes actually are incredibly out of date and shouldn't reflect the way that we judge people now in 2025. And therefore be much more aware of how our bias manifests itself and then do something to correct for it. And this is something you need to learn. You know, it's not an instinct, but once you learn to do it, it becomes habitual. And so what we do in our consultancy is that we run workshops in which we explain all this to people. And sometimes people's eyes are like saucers by the end of it because they thought, God, I never thought about that before. I mean, for instance, ambition. Okay, ambitious is, you have to be ambitious if you want to be a CEO. Okay, if a man is described as ambitious, well, you know, he's go-getting and he's going to do really well in life. If a woman is described as ambitious, we feel a lot more uncomfortable about that. So when I was researching the book, I Googled Joe Biden and ambitious and Hillary Clinton and ambitious. And for Biden, we got his ambitious immigration plan and his ambitious climate change plan. And for Hillary Clinton, we had pathologically ambitious and the curse of Hillary Clinton's ambition. And, you know, that just shows how even the very same word, I talked earlier about different words being used for the same character traits, even the very same word can have a negative or a positive connotation according to whether it's applied to a woman or a man. And if you're not aware of that in the first place, then all these stereotypes are going to be perpetuated. So it really is just a question of raising awareness, I think.
That is super fascinating. And then Hetty, what are you hearing from boards around the sort of most important CEO leadership skills right now? And any potential sort of biases in terms of positive or negative around women CEO candidates?
Yeah, well, first of all, I couldn't resist listening to you just talking there, Marianne. I was talking to an AI behavioral specialist recently, and she'd done a review of if you researched men and women in terms of jobs and CEOs and sorts of characteristics that come up. Two of the top three, if you're a woman, were pink and housekeeper, which I first of all wasn't aware that pink was a job, but housekeeper is one, and men included CEO and president. So just as a little anecdote to add to your Biden Clinton one, but to get a little bit more serious, I suppose as we are clearly all aligning on the fact that the CEO job is getting harder and ever harder because the world is increasingly and probably going to stay in a perpetual state of relative volatility. And when you think about that, Margot, and your question, what we are finding from our own research, but also what chairs and nomcos and indeed CEOs are starting to recognise, is a skill set which is really only now being defined. Our definition of it is multi-systems thinking. Now, what does that mean? What it means is your ability to understand that ever more complex mosaic within which you live. So it is from your customer to your client base, to your colleagues, to your employees, regulators, shareholders, you name it. It is a seriously complex web. And how are you making sure that you can navigate that and understand how it all just might fit together in the service of your business? And if you think about that new and emerging skill and the lack of CEO optionality that we've all agreed that we have, it's actually one of the key reasons why Margot and I set up and co-founded RRA Artemis. Because RRA Artemis is both a movement and a program. So the movement is around increasing greater leadership optionality in totality, but through service of leveraging that 50% of the population that's currently underutilized, that being women. And then a CEO program, which is around accelerating women executives' readiness to become a CEO. But very much listening to you, Marianne, a minute ago, it is absolutely not about the confidence boost and then you go find the ecosystem. The movement is all about the ecosystem and how we can shift gears within that. But to give you a sense about where does this all connect on the multi-systems thinking point, one of the big pieces of insights that we've got early times out of our Artemis work has been around what are the fundamental drivers we're finding for women executives to want to lead and want to be CEO. And consistently, we're finding that motivation is they're driven by impact. Impact is about looking across your holistic ecosystem and understanding how you can attach yourself to that in service of the benefit of the organization you're leading. That is a very nice proxy for multi-systems thinking.
Yeah.
So for us, that's just one example of an opportunity that we could really get after when widening the aperture here. So if you're a board sitting around thinking about how am I trying to solve for this, if you're in Jörn's shoes, as you said, it's your board responsibility to think about what are you really after. Actually, if you get after what are the competencies we're truly trying to solve for, what's the motivation we really need, you are going to increase the choice of and improve the choice of CEO that you make.
It's interesting, the complexity of being a CEO. You know, I've had the opportunity to observe a woman who's a CEO of a publicly listed company and a very successful one with her director hat on, right, of a client of mine, where she sat on the board, where she was actually considered not one of the strongest or the most formidable directors. Then I've also seen her in her day job with her team, where she was absolutely beloved, in part because she could say, I don't know, and would bring people together to solve new problems together. And it was unbelievably galvanizing and actually quite impactful. And it was just interesting to see that sort of difference. So anyway, let's move on to the third finding, because I think we're a smidge behind, but loving the conversation. And the third finding is what we were calling the ambition confidence double bind. And several of you have alluded to this already, but women CEOs were 73% more likely to have articles mention their ambition compared to their male counterparts, as you were saying, Marianne. Strikingly, they were twice as likely to be described as too ambitious, and simultaneously twice as likely to be described as lacking ambition, confusing. Interestingly, the confidence narrative shows something similar, which is many were described as lacking confidence, yet rarely described as having the right amount of confidence. And so, Lisa, how does this resonate with your experience as CEO?
Yeah, I mean, it both my CEO and frankly my work on boards. I think what it comes down to is a couple of things. One is that when we think about it, men really don't have to state their intentions, whether it's intention to become CEO or intention to raise money or start a company or anything else. But in the CEO context, it's sort of assumed. I remember sitting in a boardroom in a CEO succession conversation, as Hetty was saying about the people she talked about, very qualified woman who ran a P&L, man who ran a P&L. And the question, and we were talking about 4 or 5 different candidates. It was very early stages. This was a few years ago. And a director said, well, we don't know if this woman, would she really want to be CEO? And we just had a 10-minute conversation about a man who literally ran the other P&L. And that question was never asked. And so as a director, I just said, how come we didn't ask that about such and such? I mean, why would we just assume that that's his lifelong goal? And just that, again, I think Marianne said that awareness of a different conversation in the same room, 12 minutes later, is helpful for us as we keep it top of mind. As CEO, I think the same thing in the sense that women, certainly for me, I felt that I really had to, not so much ambition, but on the confidence side, I really was questioned a lot more by my male counterparts and by my CXO level team members. So I had to be much more forceful and confident. Not that I also said, I don't know, or let's work this out together. I never pretended to know. But I'll give you an example. When I took over as CEO, I did the first 90 days. I had my first meeting with the team, and a man on the team stopped me mid-sentence. I'm the brand new CEO, and said, before you finish, I think I should just tell you about the cadence of like how we do things around here. This is a true story. And I said, I tell you what, if the cadence of how you did things around here worked, I would not be sitting in this seat right now. This is literally day one. You can imagine how long he worked at the organization. But the point is, I might have been seen then as very sort of, pushy, if you will. But would a male CEO have had to answer to that question? Probably not. And so I think that's the dichotomy and the double bind, if you will, that I'm seeing in the research.
Interesting. Hetty, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's really resonating, thinking also what you just said, Lisa and Marianne, when you talked about the stereotypes, which is kind of where we're going a bit as well. And, we're thinking about this double bind as, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? So and there's this ever oscillating bar, and it's almost impossible to hit it just at the right line. And if you think about, I have no doubt that this has prevented other women becoming CEO, because are they sufficiently likable and just about the right amount of confidence? And that seems to be a sort of almost impossible notion. And Lisa, thinking about what you just said around, not only, I would concur, not only would a woman have been asked that, would a man have been asked that question, also were they asking the question because you were a woman? It's just like the whole thing is kind of quite skewed. But indeed, if you had been a man responding to that question, you might have got plaudits for being clear-sighted and positively directional. But as we know, this isn't just a kind of it isn't just a stew on stuff that's complicated. It's also thinking about what else can we do. And I suppose if we talk about Margot, where I was referring to that multi-systems thinking opportunity, but also skill set. I think if you think about where Jorgen was going as well, every organization is necessarily different, but if you boil it back to its first principles, and if you're thinking about CEO succession and then into selection, what are the core things we're truly trying to solve for? So also Marianne's point on stripping away the bias and the narrative. What are we trying to solve for, and what should we truly value? And then think about what you think your potential biases are of presumed competence and value. You can start to find yourself somewhere different. And I can tell from lived experience, in recent times, I've been attached to 3 CEO succession processes within the FTSE. We deployed that level of thinking where you stood back to first principles and challenged yourself on what you were seeking to really solve for. 3 things happened. 1, the choice, the scope and the range and the quality of choice that the board got to choose from was much greater. Secondly, as we looked as time evolved, actually the ordering of those individuals in terms of level of priority of where they were doing in terms of contention changed markedly, and it even affected positively the final selection that was made. So if thinking about that when working with our clients and taking it back to this, what are we solving for? What are the real competencies? And we can see and have a process that over the long term is focused on that, we could get to some much better, higher quality, richer outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And so Jorgen, building off of what Hetty was saying, just in terms of defining what is really needed in the CEO so that you're not overlooking people and that you're assessing them. And what is your counsel on that? And also, what role does culture play in all this?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's important. I mean, I want to go first to a place we were on just before, and then I'll nuance it a bit. It is a must that the board insists to have diverse candidates for CEO succession, and especially men and women. And it must do so with conviction and sincerity, otherwise they will not be served up. And the way to ask the question is, I know she's impossible to get, but just tell me if she was approachable, who is it? And then you start from there. It's a very simple thing to do. If you fail there, you've lost the battle. Number 2 is that I would say it's easier when you're building a board, because thankfully many shareholders also here in the US are now insisting on gender diversity on the board, also in many parts of Europe. And so it is an explicit search criteria when you discuss as a board who's our next board member. It's not wrong to say it must be a woman. You must say the next board member we recruit is a woman. Otherwise, we're not even looking at the candidate. So again, I just want to stress the very overt, explicit nature of that. The second thing I feel like saying, based on your intro, Margot, is that we should, of course, and you'll know this, but I'll say it anyway, recognize that women are also very different. And again, the naive, terrible way I learned that is about 15 years ago when the Lego Group was doing a big ethnographic effort to understand how Lego products might be more interesting to girls than to boys. There were girls buying the product. And we thought, including myself, I'll just make myself again personal here, there were like 9 different kind of ways boys loved Lego. They were different personality styles. And then there was one girl. And of course, I remember the ethnographic team coming back from staying in families at homes in Beijing, in Boston, and in Berlin. And they came back and said, oh, there's actually 9 different kinds of ways that girls behave and act. Oh, surprise. But so I think it's important to remind ourselves as that as well, that when we recruit a female CEO or board member, we get very different personalities, of course, and there's plenty of room for that. So there may be certain personality profiles that are more suited for a particular situation, but I would say my general feeling is no. Generally, different personalities can solve the same problem. They'll do it in each their own way. And it's really crucial that they do it in each their own way, because otherwise they lose authenticity, and thereby they lose followership, and thereby they lose the opportunity to shape the culture, because culture can only be shaped by an authentic leader, because organizations will only truly believe the authentic leader instead of the one who says, oh, we're all about execution. And then everybody's thinking cynically, yeah, whatever, that's what he or she has to say. It's not really the truth.
Really interesting. And then Marianne, how do these findings connect to the broader patterns that you've observed?
Yeah, I think confidence is such a difficult path for women to navigate, as Hetty said. First of all, we are socialized as girls and women to be less overtly confident than boys, almost from birth. And so if you look at a bunch of boys playing and socializing together, a lot of what they're doing is a sort of boastful competitiveness. You know, I've scored more goals than you this season, or my dad's got a better car than yours. And that's actually how they bond. Now, we are taught to bond in exactly the opposite way. We bond through modesty and self-deprecation. And so girls will say, oh, I hate my hair. It's too curly. I can't do anything with it. Or, you know, I'm useless at maths, or whatever it is. And that's how girls and women bond. Now, if a girl started to behave like a boy and telling all the other girls how brilliant she was and how she had scored more netball goals or whatever it is, she would be immediately ostracized. So we are taught from a very early age to be modest and self-deprecating. Boys are taught to be boastful and self-promoting. Now, the trouble is that if you want to succeed in your career, quite often it involves being confident and assertive and selling yourself and being and self-promoting. And so, you know, if you go to a job interview and you don't tell them, you know, what you're good at and why you should be hired, then you're not going to get the job. But women, A, aren't as good at doing that because we've been taught to do the opposite. And B, if we do it, as Jorgen said earlier, you know, when the woman said, I'd be brilliant at this job, it makes people recoil. It makes them feel really uncomfortable. And they think, oh, she's too big for her boots, in a way that they wouldn't think if a man did. And so we have this incredibly difficult double bind. We're either not confident enough or not overtly confident enough, and therefore we're disrespected and we're not taken seriously and we're not given the job, or we are confident enough and then we're disliked because we're going against stereotype. And you may say, well, you should just grow a thicker skin and who cares if you're disliked? But the trouble is, all the research shows that likability is a much more important factor for women than it is for men when it comes to being hired or being promoted. Now, men just don't have these problems at all. So it's as if we're like Simone Biles, you know, on this sort of incredibly narrow balance beam, and men are just sauntering along the floor. And so I just think you have to be really careful when you're evaluating, hiring, promoting women, just to notice these reactions in yourself. And if you find yourself thinking, oh, I think she's a bit too big for her boots, or she's too much, ask yourself, too much what? I mean, actually, she's obviously very competent, she's very intelligent, she's confident. Let's hire her rather than, and if I feel she's too much, that's telling me more about myself than it is about the candidate. But we have to be very intentional and very, you know, aware of these things going on in the sort of reptilian part of our brain.
Say more about the likability factor, though, with women versus men. I'm really, you know, interested on that.
Yeah, so women are expected to be warm and likable because that's the stereotype for women. We're supposed to be warm, kind, unselfish, nurturing, unself-promoting. These are all the stereotypes for women. I talked to Helle Thorning-Schmidt, who was Danish Prime Minister, and she said that people always said, we don't know enough about you. You know, what are you really feeling? Are you warm enough? Have you got a heart? And she said, none of my male predecessors were ever asked this. And actually, as a prime minister, I want to make decisions with my head and not with my heart. And yet what the voters wanted was for me to come across as more warm and more likable. So this is something that we expect much more from women than we do from men. And actually, particularly if it's men, I'm afraid, doing the hiring or the promoting, they want to find a woman likable. And the problem is that the more competent and the more assertive and the more confident she is, quite often the less likable she is. So it's really difficult for women.
So Lisa, you've been in this seat before, right? What strategies would you give to other women who have to navigate these contradictory expectations?
So I think one goes directly back to Hetty's multi-systems thinking, which is real. And I didn't understand this coming into the role. I had to learn this, much as Jorgen was saying earlier about his experiences, which is you really have to understand your stakeholders and how they differ and how they're the same. So, or, you know, what being authentic as a stream through that. So I'll give you an example. One of the hardest places for me was with investors, buy side and sell side. It was sort of, they don't understand this particular animal, right? That's not what they're used to seeing. Gender, race, age, I mean, the whole shebang. I do just the whole thing. And so there just really was not a lot of room for the empathy side or the likability side, in the sense that I had to keep bringing them back to my messaging around, you just have to be even overly confident when you're with that group. That's going to be it's the same you, but it's going to be a different way that you show up when you're with regulators, or when you certainly want to be a lot more deferential there, or when you're with your team or your employee base. So a lot of it is really about understanding the audience and kind of every day, like how you're showing up and moderating. You really are modulating or moderating that confidence piece based on which part of that system you're dealing with at any given time. And then it's also temporal from an event perspective. Like, so for example, we own campuses and institutions all across the globe, but we had 2 in the Caribbean, and some of you may remember 2017, there were 2 hurricanes. Each of those hurricanes hit both of our medical schools, one after the other. It was chaos. It was pandemonium. That was all about, I'm making the decisions. This is not consensus building. Obviously, I'm going to call in experts, but I was expected to be always on 100%. How are we going to, evacuate these people and do all of these things? And by the way, do that without having any bad effects to business results. So I think a big part of it, back to your question, is really being able to figure out which parts, and this is the EQ, which women do have quite a high amount of, which parts of your stakeholder or your system just require full-on confident answers, and not the more consensus building piece that your team would expect.
It was very helpful. And we have 2 minutes, and Hetty, I'm going to give you 30 seconds on this one, but there was a question around opt-in versus opt-out. I think what you were talking about is actually, to Lisa's point around motivation, not assuming a woman is motivated. And we know she's less likely to raise her hand as well. So she needs to be invited early on. But Hetty, what would you add to that?
I think that's right. And you're assumed that you're in until you say you definitively are out. So it's along the journey, you're there, unless necessarily you're under consideration. It takes a deliberate act of no to exit that scenario, rather than needing to put your hand up to be selected, to your point. So yeah, so to clarify, that's exactly what we do.
And I think that was part of Jorgen's point. What would it take? So sort of taking that extra effort to not overlook her or underestimate her, right?
Exactly.
Okay, we have about a minute left, and I want to thank all of you. A couple of things that resonated with me is Jorgen saying, just demand it. And by the way, I want to acknowledge there's some questions in the Q&A around how to say that. And I just want to share, as a firm, our clients still find diverse perspectives and inclusive cultures correlated with success. So what you say publicly. Obviously, we're in a different world right now, and that needs to be navigated through gingerly. But we haven't seen that value. It doesn't lead to any less results than it did a few months ago or a year ago. So demanding that and then saying what needs to be true. I also think acknowledging, part of what we want to do is acknowledge there are differences, as a few of you pointed out, between men and women, and there are biases that come with them. And there are developmental opportunities and feedback loops that have to happen because of it. And I think that's what we're trying to make more palatable to people. The point about confidence is something we see all the time. I don't know that any of us have a perfect solution, but raising awareness. And also, as Jorgen said, creating cultures of dissent that are mature, of dissent and diverse. The more you're willing to look at things from different ways, maybe you're more likely to sort of relieve some of that. And also, by the way, just with so much volatility in the world, a lot of CEOs are saying right now, they really, really do not have the answers. And what they're not assuming is the information that they have is necessarily the best information available. And so to constantly be looking at different things, those are correlated with great CEO competencies. So I realize we're at time. I wish we had a couple more hours. We are incredibly grateful as a firm for all of you and your insights. We are taking vigorous notes, and we have about over 99 questions we haven't gotten to, which shows you the level of engagement. We will answer those questions in some form, and hopefully we can welcome you back at another time. But thank you, Mary, Ann, Lisa, Jorgen, and of course, Hetty.
Thank you so much for having
Thank
me.
you. It's been
Bye,
great.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.